So a bunch of like European, EU, and EU adjacent heads of state have been calling for a blanket ban on all Russians entering the EU, and also they've been calling for this to be done in basically every country in the world, which is very interesting. As you know, we all know, there's plenty of instances of other countries doing things that are at least as bad as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we've never heard of any calls for anything even remotely like this in those cases. Isn't that kind of interesting? So you had the heads of state, or at least the prime ministers of Estonia and Finland, calling to ban Russians from entering the European Union. Very interesting thing, because we have this narrative coming from them that simultaneously dictates that Russia is a dystopian, anti-democratic hellhole where the average citizen has no say in anything and it's a dictatorship.
Communism
but
is
at the
based...
same time, the average Russian citizen needs to be held responsible for the Russian invasion. That's very interesting. This is not just these guys. It's also the Latvian president said it as well. Average Latvian moment. Latvia is even proposing to ban the Russian language in workplaces, like in the private sphere, not even just in the public sphere, in the private sphere too. Like banning a language. Now, this is obviously ridiculous. Russian is not just spoken in Russian or even by Russians. It's an incredibly common language, for similar reasons to why English is a common language. So let's imagine a world where the USA invades Iraq.
Communism is based.
And then Americans are banned from every country in the world and the English language is banned. Could you imagine that? Obviously fucking not. And none of the people who are supporting this, who think this is a even remotely okay or rational thing to do, would ever support such a thing. But we don't even have to talk about the past. We can talk about the present. Israel's 70-year-long occupation of Palestine. Every single inch of Israel is stolen. Absolutely unequivocally stolen. And not just like under the sovereignty of another power, as a lot of Ukraine is right now, since it was invaded by Russia. But the people who live in Israel, almost ubiquitously live in homes that they stole directly from Palestinians and their very recent ancestors. Have you ever seen any of these people who support those sorts of things against Russia ever seriously advocate for banning Israelis from doing tourism, for banning the Hebrew language or whatever outside of Israel? Have you ever seen anything remotely like that? Of course not. And that's in a case where it would actually be warranted because every single Israeli is living on stolen land. Every single Russian, at least and every single Israeli is also incredibly complicit in that colonialism. They fucking love it. The 99.9% of them absolutely fucking love it. Can't say that about Russia while also maintaining that it's a dictatorship, can you? Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, sounds to me like if what Israel does is what the people want, since it's the only democracy in the Middle East, maybe we should start doing these things against Israelis then? Or is it only Russians who supposedly have no agency to influence their government according to these same people, because it's a dictatorship according to these same people? Is it only them who deserve to be specifically targeted and collectively punished for the actions of their government? Interesting, isn't it, right? Very fucking weird. Now, none of the people who are okay with this would ever be okay with a blanket ban on Americans, even though they, according to themselves, have much more of an influence on the actions of their government than Russians do. They never even remotely call for the same on Israelis, with the same sort of difference being there as well. It's just another great example of how certain victims are considered to be worthy and others are not. If you are, for one, white, for two, an ally of the Western imperialist powers in their rivalry with Russia and China, etc., you are a worthy victim. If you are, for example, on the wrong side of this arrangement, like you are a victim of an American invasion or a victim of colonialism on the part of a key American ally, like with Israel against the Palestinians, you are not a worthy victim. You can see right now all of the, they're almost pulling out all the stops here against Russia. The only thing that's mitigating them is that they kind of need Russian natural gas. Aside from that, they've pulled out everything possible. We know that they can do that against anyone. Isn't it interesting who they choose to do it against? Isn't it interesting who they choose to collectively punish? Isn't it interesting what language they choose to demonize? There is no way that you can look at this, that you can support this without experiencing a massive level of cognitive dissonance. There's no way that you can look at this and not be laid bare precisely the fact that the supposedly civilized West cares about nothing aside from exploiting others for its own benefit. And in this case, Ukraine just happens to be convenient for its own benefit. And that's all there is to it. Therefore, absolutely everything possible must be done to Russians because the EU, the US, the rest of the West, etc., are in essentially trying to crush Russian imperialism in order to advance their own much worse, much wider scope imperialism. There's no way that you can justify this without also saying the same for Americans, Israelis, etc. It just makes no sense whatsoever. And if anyone can seriously still look at this and be like, sure, USA bad, but if the USA is bad as you say, why aren't you advocating for the same thing to be done to it? If Israel is as bad as you performatively claim it is, why aren't you advocating for the same thing to be done to it? It's because the people who advocate for these sorts of things don't actually, they're not actually against US imperialism. They're not really functionally against Israeli settler colonialism. What they are is interested in furthering US imperialism while framing it from a certain progressive bent. And that's all there is to it. Like pretending to be against US imperialism, pretending to be against Israeli settler colonialism, while functionally advocating for essentially everything that helps to prop it up.